really what would unfold, and the distance between the scene and my pickup, I want to be running back and forth for equipment, so I took as much as I could.
Okay. Were there any other tools on your rifle that you used during this encounter?
My rifle was equipped with a magnified optic, a scope, and it is a loophole. You can adjust the magnification on it. It also has a reticle in it that has the ability, it's black when you look through it, but once you turn it on, it's illuminated. So once it's illuminated, it becomes red, and you can adjust the brightness of that reticle.
Okay. So were you using your rifle also basically as binoculars, as an optic?
Once I entered the scene, yes.
Okay. So how did you enter into the open space area, to the actual scene?
Once Weimerskirch, McFarland, and Ronzone all arrived, we were standing out in front of 812 Piedra Vista on the west side of the street, and there was a couple standing out in front of the house. They got our attention and told us that we could enter the open space through their backyard. They had a wood slat gate on the west side of their yard and one on the east side. So we walked through both wood slat gates and entered the open space through their yard.
Okay. And when you entered the open space from their yard, can you describe the terrain and what you saw?
The terrain was the first thing I took note of. It was a steep incline, a lot of rocks, a lot of cactus, and what I refer to as game trails. They're narrow trails that have been where the brush has been beat down by hikers or game like deer or coyotes, whatever, moving through that area, beaten, and in that same path, and just beating the grasses and everything down, so it's just a dirt path, but they're narrow.
About how wide was the game trail that you saw?
You know, they were some wider than others, but there were some as narrow as 8 to 10 inches, and there was others that were, I would say, a couple feet wide, 1.5 feet wide.
Okay. So where was the first place that you went to when you entered the open space?
As we exited the yard, there was a large evergreen tree, large cedar tree that was there. On the east side, there was a wide running track, and it was on the east side of that running track. So we would have been the wall of the residence we came through, a short area of brush, the running track, and then the large tree.
Okay. And what did you do when you reached the tree with the other officers?
Immediately when I reached the trees, I looked up at the officers, and I began to assess the situation that was in front of me.
To be clear, which officers were you looking up at?
The initial responding uniformed officers, as well as the 2 open space officers were up there. I was looking at them, their positioning, Mr. Boyd's positioning, the terrain, and taking all that in, because it was a distance for me to get small details. I turned the magnification all the way up on my rifle scope and began to use my rifle scope in order to gather intel and detail for the other officers that were with me. So I began to from that point forward through the rest of the incident, I began to, anything that I saw or any changes that I saw, I gave a quick narrative. So it was just that.
Okay. Can you give me an example of a narrative that you would give in what you saw?
For example, at one point when Mr. Boyd put his hands in his pockets, I would call out, hands in pockets. When he'd take his hands out, I would call hands out, and then with the magnification of my scope, I was able to see with great detail whatever was in his hand. I was able to notify Officer Weimerskirch, who was handling a dog, Sergeant Ingram, who had the taser shotgun and didn't have any magnification, on what was taking place. So they were up on everything that was taking place with detail.
Okay. And when you first saw these other officers up there, what were your thoughts? You said you were assessing the situation. What was your assessment of the situation?
My assessment in the situation is there was 2 problems. That the terrain was a problem. But the other two problems that I saw that raised great concern is Mr. Boyd was elevated above the officers, and there was a slope running down to the officers. Now, the distance they had would be fine if they were on a flat level surface, but because of the slope, that could be traversed by Mr. Boyd rather quickly. It almost cut their distance. It cut down considerably. So I was concerned with their distance, that they were a bit too close. And I expressed that verbally. I said, oh, I think they're too close. The other thing I saw was a crossfire situation in which the uniformed officers had placed themselves, and there was an officer up by a rock with a rifle, and directly in line with that other officer was another officer. If Mr. Boyd began to come down there and created a threat for them, and he got in between those officers would be shooting at each other. And I don't think that they realized it at that point. So that created concern. So like I said, what I voiced is that they need to move back a little bit, create some more distance, open up the reactionary gap is what I was requesting.
Okay. I'm going to show you what's been admitted as States Exhibit 13I1. Can you see that?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you describe to me what you see in this picture?
Okay, here, this is the slope that I'm speaking of to this officer. This officer...
Do you know who that officer is?
Yes, this officer is Officer Michael Monette. His rifle is slung, but it's hanging, which means he doesn't have his hands on it. It's similar to a handgun being holstered. In order for him to use it, to address it, he has to perceive the threat, reach down, get his rifle, bring up, take aim with it, get a sight picture, and then deploy with it. This is the officer that I was referring to with the rifle, and he's directly in line with this officer here, created a crossfire. These officers here, there are some with the beanbag shotgun here, and I believe there was one other beanbag shotgun. Best I can tell from looking at them and the way they were standing when I was looking at them through my optics is there was only a couple of them with their handguns out and others that were empty-handed. What I brought concern in the terrain was these cactuses here, these rocks, and this rock here and the steep terrain down. If Mr. Boyd came down towards them, they would have to, just like in a tool or drill, you would have to move in order to draw and address that threat. And in that terrain, officers are going to be tripping over themselves and trying to navigate that terrain at the same time addressing a threat that was posed by Mr. Boyd.
And after you had made these observations, what did the officers do?
Like I said, all I said was out loud while I was looking through my scope is they need to move back a little bit, create some distance. That's when what I believed at the time was Officer Weimerskirch got on the radio and two things were done. The first thing he did is he asked Sergeant Carpenter to move the officers back. I've later learned that was Officer McFarland that made that request. The second thing that Weimerskirch did was he asked if they had any charges on Mr. Boyd.
Okay. Do you know what does that mean? Do you have any charges on him?
So,
what was your understanding of that request?
In my experience in working with the K-9 unit, they have a criteria that needs to be met in order to utilize the K-9 apprehension. And the criteria, there's numerous boxes that need to be checked, but one of them is there felony charges on the individual? Do we have felony charges on the individual we're dealing with so that when they release the dog bites him? That is part of the criteria. There's other things that have to be met, which I'm not familiar with, but I do know that they have to have felony charges for the apprehension, for a K-9 apprehension.
Okay. So you weren't the one who ordered the withdrawal of field and crisis intervention team officers?
Objection, leading, Your Honor.
Were you the one? Were you the one to order the withdrawal of crisis intervention team officers?
No.
I'm going to show you what's admitted as State's Exhibit 13I2. Can you tell me what's going on in this picture and who those people are?
So, excuse me, this is Officer McFarland. This is myself. And it's just a different angle of me reporting back to them what's going on through my magnified optics.
Okay. So what was the purpose in you having your rifle up there like that?
Well, I have to be able to, because it's a magnified optics, I have to have it up. I have to have the weapon shouldered. And I have to close one eye because of the magnification on it. I have to close one eye, and I have to use it. And I was using it like a monocular at that point.
Okay. So were you aiming at Mr. Boyd?
No.
Okay. I'm now going to show you what's admitted as State's 32E2. What's going on in this picture?
This is as the officers are beginning to move down, and there's communications between, this is Sergeant Carpenter in the uniform facing us, and there's communications between, this is actually Kinron Zone right here with the dog rather than Weimerskirch. This is Kinron Zone, Jeff McFarland, Rick Ingram, and then the open space officers, and I can't see by the hat, it looks like a state policeman is on the other side of the open space officer. They're there having communications, and I'm still watching Mr. Boyd.
Where are you at here, and how do you know you're watching Mr. Boyd in this picture?
Well, because that's all I did through the whole incident was watch Mr. Boyd. Here you can see my rope patch on the back of my vest, and then you can see my rifle right here. So I'm still watching up the hill to report back what Mr. Boyd is doing.
So you said that's Officer Ronzone? That's not K-9 Officer Weimerskirch?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know where Weimerskirch was? Is he in this picture?
I don't know where he was at that point. When we first got there, like I said, they were trying to establish, gather basic information from the officers who were on scene. They were trying to get briefings on charges, things along those lines.
Okay. Now I'm going to show you what's admitted as State's 32E1. What do you recall is going on in this
Okay,
photo?
so this is, during this time here, just before this and just before the picture of Sergeant Carpenter coming down, is I was watching Mr. Boyd. Sergeant Ingram arrived during that time while I was watching him. One thing that I've been trained on at a early stage in my career and just has been ingrained to me is when there is something that you're watching, whether it be with your naked eye or through optics, is they break the habit that we all have is to make eye contact with an individual while you're to talk to him. So Rick Ingram came up behind me, and I couldn't see him. All I could hear him say is, "I'm with you, Keith. What do you need?" And that's a common term, "I'm with you." That means he's ready to go, he's behind you, and he's ready for you to tell him where he wants, what you want from him.
And what did you tell him?
I had asked him at that point, because he had a taser shotgun on him, but I didn't even know until after we had given statements that he had brought a taser shotgun. He never said, I said, "Rick, take my taser shotgun." The reason I asked him to take it is I'm holding on Mr. Boyd with my rifle. And one, I'm providing intel to the officers at the bottom who can't see with the detail that I can see. And two, these officers are beginning to move around now. And you can see this officer here, the way he's walking, his back is turned to Mr. Boyd. So it's essential that I provide a cover for him. So because I'd stepped into that role of providing intel and overwatch of the officers, I didn't want to put my rifle down, have a conversation to decide who was going to be less lethal, who was going to be a lethal cover, I was in an overwatch position and providing security for these officers. So having not known that Rick had a taser shotgun, I asked him to take mine. there's a couple other reasons that I did that is when I'm there, there's nothing to brace on. And so I want to be steady so that my rifle's not floating, it's not moving. I can stay focused on Mr. Boyd. As we move up, I find supports, rocks, things along those lines that I can put my rifle on. But that shotgun, it swings as you move, or sometimes if you shift your position, the rifle will swing, and it pulls your upper body ever so slightly, but it'll cause you to drift. So that's why I asked him to take my taser shotgun.
And did he take it? How did he take it?
Rather than me coming off my rifle, I have quick releases on all of my weapon systems. My rifle sling, I have a quick release. My breaching shotgun, my taser shotgun, my beanbag shotgun, they're all quick releases. So it's a matter of squeezing a clip and the sling breaks in two. And then, so that's what he did. He just snapped it, he reached in front of me, snapped it, and pulled it from behind me. Just kind of eased it off me, and then I was left standing there.
Now, did Acting Sergeant Ingram, as your supervisor that day, did he do anything did he instruct you to do anything other than what you were doing at that point?
No.
Okay. I'm going to show you what's been admitted as State's Exhibit 32E2. What is going on in this picture?
So this is after the officers have moved back. They haven't withdrawn, they've moved back, they've created some distance. There's actually an officer in front of us on a rock, kind of in the middle of this tree here, directly in front of us. But Mr. Boyd is sitting on a rock. He's not calm there. This is just a still photograph, but he's yelling down to the other officers. I don't know, I know at this point Mr. Boyd has knives, but I don't know what else he has. My concern is at this distance, if he has a firearm, then we need to start looking at different options. So I'm watching him, watching his hands to see what he's doing, what he's coming out of his pockets with. There's this large outcropping of rocks here that poses a good point of cover for him and concealment as well, which would create a problem for us. So again, I'm just watching him, watching his hands, watching his actions, and reporting it to the officers that are there with me.
Okay. At this point, Boyd, the picture you described, Boyd is sitting up there and there's no officers around him. Why couldn't you all just leave at that point?
Mr. Boyd had created, like I said, he had committed aggravated assault on a police officer. The officers were there to take him into custody.
Okay. So after McFarland had ordered the withdrawal here, what happened next?
So we stayed at the tree for a moment. Once, while we were at the tree, Officer Ronzone took a uniformed officer and went to the north for north containment.
Did you tell Officer Ronzone to do that?
No.
Do you know who did?
No,
Okay.
I don't know. I only heard him say, "I'm going north." So that's how I knew he left. Like I said, my focus was always on Mr. Boyd. What happened behind me, if I couldn't see it in my peripheral, I can't see what's going on.
Okay. What about McFarland? Where was he at this point?
McFarland was still with us. He left and he went to the south and eventually to the southeast to be part of a southern containment team.
And did you tell him to do that?
No.
Now, what is the difference between the tactical, well, I guess at some point after McFarland leaves, after Ronzone leaves up, what did you do?
Weimer-Skirch, there was a uniformed officer, like I said, in front of us at a large rock, and Weimer-Skirch told us to push up and hold at that rock. It turned out that uniformed officer was Officer Monette. I walked up to the rock and braced my rifle on the rock and continued to watch him. Watch Mr. Boyd.
Do you remember any conversation between Officer Weimerskirch and Officer Monette?
Yes, there was dialogue between Officer Monette and Officer Weimerskirch.
Okay. Do you remember what they were talking about?
I can't tell you with any degree of certainty. I later learned what it was about.
What was it about?
Objection, Your Honor, hearsay.
That's fine. I want to go to when you moved up the mountain a little bit more. About how far did you make the first move up the mountain?
At that rock, we were approximately 30 yards from Mr. Boyd.
And what are you seeing Mr. Boyd doing this time?
He's very animated. He's asking, his first question to us once we come to the rock is, what's your status of office? And Weimerskirch begins dialogue with him at that point. He's confused by what's your status of office. He asks him, what do you mean? And Mr. Boyd says, are you OSI, Department of Defense, FBI, who are you? And Weimerskirch answers, we're APD. Mr. Boyd responds, APD can't help me. And he starts to ask for military. He wants military response to our location. Oh, Weimerskirch asked him if he knew what the Posse Comitatus Act was. Mr. Boyd was now confused about the Posse Comitatus, so Officer Weimerskirch began to explain it to him, and how Posse Comitatus is they cannot activate military for civilian issues or civilian events. And so Mr. Boyd responded, that's why we have state police here. They're a liaison to the governor, and the governor can activate the military.
Okay. So at what point did you see Sergeant Ware come up?
That's when Weimerskirch told him state police is here, and he said, we'll get him. And he called Sergeant Ware, who was down at the bottom along that running track, called him up to the rock. And as soon as Mr. Boyd saw Mr. Ware, or Sergeant Ware, he got extremely agitated. He started yelling, he already has his instructions, I've already told him what to do, and he begins to threaten Sergeant Ware. He threatens him, telling him that he ought to come down there and kill him, cut him up, and take his hat, and then makes a comment that he collects hats. Mr. Boyd just continues to get agitated by Sergeant Ware, so Officer Weimerskirch just had dialogue with Sergeant Ware and said that he wasn't going to be beneficial to us up there, so he asked him to go down to the bottom.
Was Sergeant Ware wearing any tactical gear?
He was wearing his black and grays, which is just your normal state police uniform.
Did Sergeant Ware ever draw his gun on Mr. Boyd?
Not while he was with us.
Did Mr. Boyd, in this perception that you're seeing at this time, did he demonstrate any fear towards officers?
No, he got extremely agitated, was very aggressive in his voice, yelling very loud. Even though there was that distance between us, it was very clear what he was saying.
So, I guess after the encounter between Mr. Boyd and Sergeant Ware, what did Mr. Boyd do next?
Mr. Boyd, once Sergeant Ware removed himself, Mr. Boyd was up there, he began talking about having numbers on a cell phone. He put his hands in his pocket.
Was this the first time you'd seen him put his hands in his pocket?
Yes.
Okay.
I saw him put his right hand into his pocket. I watched it close to my scope, called it out. Right hand in pocket, hands out. As soon as he began to break his pocket line with his hand, and I could see what was in his hand, I saw it was a cell phone. So I called it a cell phone. And he lifted up the cell phone, and he started talking about his cell phone's full of numbers.
Before you get into what he said, I want to get back. Can you said you actually could see from your optics that this was a cell phone?
The minute that it began to break the pocket and I was able to identify it as a cell phone, I called it a cell phone. It wasn't, I can say that it was probably not all the way out of his pocket, but the majority of it was out of his pocket when I was able to identify it as a cell phone because of the magnification on my optics.
Mr. Boyd had just threatened to kill officers, and he reaches in his pocket and pulls something out. Why didn't you shoot him at that moment?
I didn't, like I said, I was able to clear his hands. I was able, with that, the magnification on those optics, I was able to watch his hands. I was able to identify as things were breaking the line of his pocket with the magnification on those optics. It was a great help to me on that scene.
What about the distance? What was the distance between the officers at this point?
He would pace back and forth, so I would have to give between 30 and 40 yards.
In your view, at that time, was James Boyd an imminent deadly threat?
No.
Okay. Now, did Boyd say anything about the cell phone that he drew?
He did. He began to talk about having numbers on the cell phone that he needed to get to the FBI. He was still very agitated, and this is where he began to rant. He would jump from one rant to the next, and he would, in this one, he started to explain about the phone numbers on his cell phone and the importance of getting it to the FBI. And then within finishing one sentence, his next sentence was, he made a statement that said, all homeless people are child molesters, but I'm not homeless. And then he began to talk about child molesters for a while, and then went right back into a national security problem. He was jumping between subjects in his rants, and you couldn't ever make out exactly where he was going or with it.
Okay. And what's going through your mind when you're hearing these statements and you're seeing his behavior at this point?
I'm concerned. I'm concerned about his anger. I'm concerned about how his mind is jumping from one topic to the next, which is a sign of unpredictability.
You said you were watching him through your magnification and your optics.
Yes.
Was there ever a time when you lost visual on him?
So when he's yelling, when he's in the middle of this rant of cell phone and homeless people and national security, with him yelling, Officer Ronzbone's canine, his police service dog, begins to bark. He begins to make a lot of noise, whining and barking on the north side. So Mr. Boyd hears it, and he walks over to the northern area of that rock feature that he's up in, and looks. I can't see him. I can't. I'm not gonna say he looks. He goes to the north side of it, and I can just see the very top of his head, maybe a couple inches of his black do-rag as it moves along the rocks. So I tell everybody, I've lost visual of him. I don't have him. And then that's my narrative for that point.
Okay. At this point in this encounter, have any other officers arrived?
I can't say that I saw them arrive, but what I can say is Mr. Boyd, while he's up there talking to us, he has seeing eyeglasses on, and with a magnetic attachment is a tinted lens. So because the sun is going down, the sun is setting and it's coming from the west, that he would take the lens off his glasses and put his hand over his eyes here, and he would stop talking for a minute and he would stare down at the gate. And then he would watch for a moment, watch to where you could see him following whatever it was came through the gate to where they were at, and then he would come back. Then when, as time went, I was able to figure out because of his actions, and then hearing a new officer on the radio, I was able to put two and two together to understand that's what he was doing. Anytime a new officer, he would watch to go where they positioned themselves.
Okay, so at this point, after Ronzone's dog, after you lost visual, did you regain visual of him?
He came back out, yes.
When he came back out, what did he do?
He began to ask about a hotel voucher that had been offered to him by the uniformed officers. This was one of the things that as we continued to get on and through the incident, he would become more agitated that this hotel voucher was not given to him. But at this point, he begins to talk about a hotel voucher, and then he goes to how the original responding officers had assaulted him, and he told Officer Weimerskirch, they drew guns on me, and he said, "You have the knives."
Who said you have the knives?
Officer Weimerskirch told Mr. Boyd, "Yes, but you have the knives. So why don't you put the knives down?" Mr. Boyd said that he had the right to be armed. And he, while he's talking about having the right to be armed, he puts his right hand into his pocket again. Again, I call it right hand in his pocket. And as he pulls his right hand out, I can clear it this time. It is a knife. I can see the knife as it comes out. I can see the knife with great detail. When he holds it in his hand, but he'll change his grip on it. Not that he changes the position of the knife in his hand, but he'll open his fingers and pinch it between his thumb and forefinger or pointer finger and hold it in his hand and point it for a while. So I was able to, as he's doing this, I could see that the knife, and I described it to him, black knife, locking blade. I could see that it had a large lug on it, that it could be opened with the thumb. Silver blade, and I could get great detail of it, and I gave it to the officers, so they had it as well. So they knew they were dealing with the locking blade style knife.
And he just pulled one knife out at this point?
Yes.
Okay. What did he do with the knife?
He would pull it out. He pulled it out. He talked for a while, and then he turned it around in his hand and stuck it into his right pocket, handle first, with the blades up.
Okay. What happened after he put the knife away?
He continued to rant.
What was he ranting about this time?
I'm trying to keep all of it together. He would rant about the national security, the money, and it went on so long, I can't recall all of them.
What was the lighting like at this point?
So the sun, like I said, as he was looking it over, the sun is starting to go down. It's starting to cast some shadows. So with the shadows at points, even when Mr. Boyd is towards the southern end of the rock feature, the shadows are making it hard for us to see what he's doing.
Did you actually see the shadows?
Yes. So I began to go through a checklist. Okay, what happens if it gets dark? If it gets dark, all I have is, for illumination, is my rifle-mounted light, which they're very bright and very effective for room clearing, but they don't have a long life to them.
How is your rifle light? How does it operate?
It's mounted to the side of my Picatinny rail system on my rifle. I have an angled grip on the front of my rifle, and the light is there, so I just have to flip my thumb, and it turns the light on.
What happens if you can you turn your light up or down?
No.
Okay.
The light on the rifle just has one brightness setting. So I go over that. I know that's going to be a problem. I also realize that once it gets dark, I'm not going to be able to see the black reticle inside my scope that I described. So I turn on the illumination for the reticle, and as I do this, I'm cognizant this reticle because it's bigger than just a dot. And I can draw it here for you. It's a circle with a dot, and then it has hatch marks on each end. So because of the size of this reticle in here, if you turn it up too high and it's not completely dark, it will wash the scope out. So it reflects inside there and you can't see. So I turn it up, and while I'm watching Mr. Boyd, I hold it on him, and I'm adjusting the brightness of that reticle to ensure that, one, I'm still watching what he's doing, still reporting details, but that the reticle setting isn't so high that it's washing out the scope and I'm not able to see his actions.
Okay. At some point, did you move up the mountain further?
Yes.
About how far did you move up the mountain this next move?
So we were probably moved up another 15 yards maybe.
Is this where Officer Monette and the field officers were?
No, they were at that first rock.
Okay.
So we moved up to the second rock and placed it in front of us. Because of the darkness and the shadows that were being casted, we were actually losing visual of Mr. Boyd as he began to move back to the north. We couldn't see him, and it was making it extremely hard for me to be able to call out details in the shadows. So as we moved up, again, it raised our elevation, and we were able to see him better.
Were you able to see his campsite from this view?
Not in its entirety, no.
Were you able to see more of it than you were at the first rock?
Yes.
Okay. Did you notice any pathways? You discussed pathways earlier. Were there any pathways in this area between
There
you and
was,
Mr. Boyd?
there was one that we obviously walked up to the rock, and then there was one that led from Mr. Boyd just to the east of us, and there were others that went around to the east and up the side of U Mound.
Okay. Now, I'm going to take you to a conversation. Do you remember a conversation between Sergeant Ingram and Officer Weimer-Skirch?
I did.
Tell me about what you recall in that conversation.
It was a two-part conversation throughout our stand there. The first part of the conversation was Sergeant Ingram and Officer Weimer-Skirch talking about the deployment of the taser shotgun and its effect on the dog.
Who said what about the deployment and what effect it would have on a dog?
So Officer Weimer-Skirch told Acting Sergeant Ingram that if they deploy the taser shotgun, it's gonna affect the dog biting. There was a break in there, and then there was a time later where Weimer-Skirch told Ingram to deploy the taser shotgun first. He said, go ahead and X-rep him, is what he said. And X-rep is the name, the official name, I guess, of the taser shotgun. He said, go ahead and X-rep him.
So what did you believe then about the deployment of the dog based on Weimer-Skirch's earlier statement to Sergeant Ingram about the effectiveness of the taser shotgun with the
That
dog?
if Sergeant Ingram was going to deploy the taser shotgun, that there would be a lag time, and when I say a lag time, I'm guessing the 20-second cycle time before Weimer-Skirch sent the dog.
And it was Weimer-Skirch who had told Ingram about this?
Yes,
Okay.
it was Weimer-Skirch that told Ingram to X-rep it.
Now, was there any negotiations with Mr. Boyd going on at this point?
There were. Officer Weimer-Skirch, he worked hard. He worked hard constantly talking to Mr. Boyd. He tried to talk to him about the hotel. He tried to get him to put his knives down numerous times. Each time he would ask him to put his knives down, he would become agitated with it, stating that he wasn't going to put them down. He would, at one point, he got upset and said, what are you doing to get my hotel? I mean, it doesn't even have to be a nice hotel. You can put me in a Motel 6. It doesn't have to be. And then he started rambling off higher-end hotels. He said, I feel secure in a hotel. And then he talks about how his ID was stolen. And then he locked on to me, holding on him over the rock. I'm watching through my scope. And he got agitated. And he began to yell, you guys are continuing to assault me. And he says, if I was the governor's son, or did just come up here to hang out and was underneath this rock, would you guys treat him the same way? If it was just some kid, would you treat him the same way? And this was the first time that I saw him put both of his hands into his pockets.
Okay. Did you ever talk to Mr. Boyd?
No, I never said anything to Mr. Boyd.
Were you guys assaulting Mr. Boyd?
No.
Okay. So after you said this was, well, first of all, I want to go back to, because at some point after you guys moved up, did Boyd become more agitated?
He did make statements like when we first got up there, don't rush up on me because you'll lose. He was agitated.
Okay.
And then there was times where we would get up there and he would settle down. There was a point where the incident almost stopped for a moment. It just kind of, the whole world stopped turning at that moment later on in the incident.
Right now, do you recall ever when you encountered an Officer Sedler?
While we were up there, yes, while we were at that second point, Officer Sedler had, again, was another one that Boyd would cover, shield his eyes from the sun. Again, from behind me, I heard a voice, and the voice was, I recognized as Anthony Sedler. I also saw him after he initially contacted me out of my peripheral on my right side. He come up to me and says, "You good, Keith? You need a spell?"
What's a spell?
So a spell is a term I used when I first went to tactical, probably 9 years prior, 10 years prior to this. A spell is if you're watching someone or you've been doing a job for a while, a spell is a rest. Let me give you a rest for a moment, and then you can go back to it. And it's just that. So with what he meant is I've been watching Boyd through my optics for a period of time. He wanted to know if I wanted relief from it. But a spell always ends. It becomes a rotation. And you just kind of change duty there, but you're never really completely relieved of your duty.
Do you know where Sedler went after?
I don't.
Okay.
I thought he was with us until during that time.
At this point, is there anyone directing placement of officers?
Yes. It's at this point that I hear Sergeant Fox on the radio. Sergeant Fox begins to kind of go down his checklist. I can hear him contacting Weimerskirch, Ronzone, making different tactical call signs on the radio.
Okay. Was there ever a time when you saw Sergeant Ingram raise his taser shotgun up at Boyd, other than the time when he actually deployed it?
Yes. While we were there at that rock, like I said, there's a game trail or a walking path that comes down from Mr. Boyd's location to the rock. And during one of Mr. Boyd's rants, he becomes upset with with Officer Weimerskirch, and he says, "I ought to come down there and kill you right now." And he puts his right hand in his pocket. I call it out, right hand's in his pocket. And he starts walking towards us aggressively. And he's coming down to us. His hands are in his pocket. He gets to about between 20 and 15 feet. And I'm watching him. I'm watching his hands through my scope. And I'm just focused on him. And out as I'm watching him, because my right eye's open, I can see my peripheral, the yellow fore-end come up from the taser shotgun. So it's just, I can't make it out. I know it's yellow, so I know what it is. Comes up, and Mr. Boyd stops. As he stops, he's close enough in front of me where I can lift my head out from my scope and see him clearly. So when I lift my head and open both eyes, I can see that Sergeant Ingram's pointed the taser shotgun at him. He stopped and then turned around and then went back up to his camp.
You said that Mr. Boyd, when he had said, "I ought to kill you right now," started walking towards the officers, that he had his hand in his pocket.
Yes.
Did he ever pull his hand out of his pocket?
No. I could just see the upper portion of his hand and his wrist during that time.
He had just said he was going to kill you and started walking in an aggressive way within 15 feet. Why didn't you shoot him then?
So I knew Mr. Boyd was armed. I knew Mr. Boyd had a knife in his pocket. I knew his hand was in that pocket. But the difference is there was a large rock. Like I said, we placed the rock between him and us when we went up there. There was a large rock in front of us. There was a bunch of smaller rocks, but it was a large area that went down to the northwest, and above us was cactus. In order for Mr. Boyd to mount an attack, he would have had to either go up and go through the cactus or come over top of that big rock. We had a large barrier between us. There was a level of threat, but it wasn't to the point that called for a deadly force action.
Can you explain that in context with this State's Exhibit 59?
So it's just that in what I explained in armed assailant in the red, he's armed, he's threatening, saying that He has, I ought to come down there and kill you. We know he has a knife. He's closing the distance. But with the show of force that happened is the less lethal is what stopped him. It wasn't the fear of my rifle that was pointed at him that stopped him. It was the less lethal taser shotgun that when it was pointed at him, stopped him.
What about application of your standard operating procedures? How would you apply this instance with Mr. Boyd in terms of whether he was an imminent threat?
Intent and means, but no opportunity.
Okay. So you said Boyd walked back without drawing the knives, right?
Yes.
What did he do next?
Oh, he was up on top, and he's agitated. He's still agitated about my rifle. He's agitated about the hotels. And I see him put...
What kind of, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
You see him
So
what?
I see him put both hands into his pockets this time. Right and left hand comes out into his pockets. Call it again, both hands in the pockets. Both hands are out, knives in both hands. And this is the first time I see him draw the two knives. He pulls them out, holds them about chest level. I can see through my optics that they're almost identical in their manufacturing. So he holds them and rants, makes threats, and again he spins them around in his hand and puts them, as he's drawing his hands back to his pocket, he spins them around and puts them into his pockets. He's very fluid in his movements with the knife, pulling them out, flipping around, flipping them back, putting them back inside there. He's very fluid in his movements. It's almost like it was rehearsed, like he'd done it numerous times.
How many times do you recall seeing Mr. Boyd pulling out the knives during this encounter?
To include the
one knife?
No, ma'am. To include all of them when deadly force took place?
Yes.
4 times.
What was going through your mind hearing Boyd's comments and seeing these knives resurfacing?
I think my level of concern just continued to get greater because, one, he'd just come down the hill with his hand in his pocket. He wasn't intimidated or worried about me hanging a rifle over the top of a rock and watching him through my scope. It concerned me because he wasn't fearful of the rifle, but he was fearful of the taser shotgun. The way he handled his knives, he drew them very quickly, manipulated them in his hands and put them back in his pocket very quickly. That made me very concerned. If he was to mount an attack, it could be very quick. His movements were very quick, very fluid.
Did James Boyd ever throw anything at the officers?
This is the moment when the world stopped. Oh, we were there, and he was on a rant about being assaulted. Again, during this rant, he said that he got out of prison 5 months ago, and after getting out of prison, I apologize, while he was in prison, he said, "I've been murdered twice and committed suicide twice." His rants aren't making sense, and while he's ranting and yelling at us about being murdered twice and suicide twice, he picks up a sandwich that he had gotten out of his camp earlier. When he walked into his camp, he came out, and I called it a sandwich. It's in his hand. He set it down. He picked up the sandwich, and it was a sandwich and a dinner roll, and he threw them at us. And when he threw the sandwich and the dinner roll at us, it went. So if this monitor, I'll be standing this way, if this monitor would be Weimer Skirch's head, it came between the two of us, kind of shifted off, and it came down between us and landed, I would say probably 5 to 7 feet right behind us, kind of in a little bit of bush, and the dog turned and started eating the sandwich. And that's when it stopped, because even Mr. Boyd stopped and looked at it, and he said, well, he can have it. And so it just took everything away from the moment at that point. He threw the roll down at us, but...
So describe why in your mind at this point things stopped? How was it different?
I don't know. I don't know why it changed. I don't know if Mr. Boyd didn't realize till after he threw it that he threw his sandwich. Because even he answered, he said, well, he can have it. And so it was based on his actions and his response that made everything stop. We were thinking different things. I was thinking something completely different when he threw that.
What were you thinking when Boyd threw the sandwich?
He was ranging us.
He was what?
Ranging.
What do you mean?
So when you are looking at an object and it's a flat level surface and you're familiar with judging ranges, it's easy to say that's 20 yards, that's 30 yards. When you put a slope or any type of incline or elevation into your judgment, it will throw it off unless you have done that range things on a slope or at a different elevation. So I thought Mr. Boyd, because where we were standing, we had moved up there, he'd made the threats about killing us, he had his rants, pulled out his knives, he threw the sandwich to see exactly how far we were from him.
And you said the sandwich landed right near you?
It went between Officer Weimerskirch and myself and behind us in a bush.
Okay. And I have to ask this. You said he also threw a roll?
He did throw a roll.
Did you make a statement about the roll after this shooting?
I did. I mentioned that it was a dinner roll. I'm a mental picture kind of person. I have to have a mental picture of it. So a lot of times in my descriptions, I will match something that I know so that people can get a mental picture. And when I was telling Officer Stone or Detective Stone that it was a roll, it was like a roll that comes in a Church's Chicken. In my head, I pictured a little box from Church's Chicken with the chicken and a white dinner roll in it. That's the type of roll that he threw at us.
So when Boyd threw the roll at you, you didn't know it came from Church's Chicken?
No.
Okay. And you didn't have any evidence that he was in Church's Chicken?
No.
Okay. I want to get to something that's been discussed a lot, and that's the plan. First of all, you said you had some communication with Fox. Did Sergeant Fox ever give you any instructions?
He contacted me. They were asking, he was kind of gathering positions of officers, and he contacted me directly on the radio, asking or telling me, he said there will be 34s or officers directly to your east, making me aware that where the officers were. I took it for granted at that point that he knew exactly where we were because he was telling me I had officers to my east. But I also known that we had moved from the first time I heard him on the radio, so I wanted to let him know that we'd moved. We moved further east, so that if he had questions or concerns about where we were at, he had an idea. So I advised him that I was clear on that there were officers to my east, and then my next statement was we've moved to the east a little bit.
Did he express any concerns to
No.
you? Okay. And at this point, had you seen any SWAT officers arrive yet?
Other than Anthony Sedler, I had not.
And, well, had you been instructed that there were any SWAT officers there to relieve you?
No, not at that point.
Did Fox dialogue with anyone else in this arrest team?
I'm sorry?
Did Fox have dialogue with anybody else in this arrest team?
He did. So I have, my radio was set up where my handheld radio was on the right side of my carrier, and it came up to I had a speaker over my ear, and then I had a mic that came down in front of my face, so I can hear everything on the radio very clear. Also, what it makes is that when we're there, the individual we're dealing with can't hear radio transmissions. So if something comes out that's sensitive that we don't want him to hear, that's what we were using. So I did hear Fox make contact with Officer Weimerskirch.
What did Sergeant Fox tell Officer Weimerskirch?
They had different dialogue while we were up there at that rock, and after we shifted from the rock to where we were standing before the incident with Mr. Boyd. They had conversation about, one, who was up there with him, and two, if Weimerskirch told him that we had a plan in place in case he comes to us. And then he had a conversation where once we moved from the rock to where we were standing in front of the cactus, that requesting more bodies and less lethal tools.
Weimerskirch asked Sergeant Fox for more bodies and less lethal tools?
It was later.
Okay.
We were still at the rock, but that was a later conversation.
So Officer Weimerskirch tells Fox that there's a plan in place in
Yes.
case he comes towards us. What
Yes.
was your understanding of the plan?
Up at that point, Officer Weimerskirch asked, who has a bang? Meaning, who has a flashbang, a noise flash diversionary device? There was a pause. Ingram didn't answer, so I said, I do. He said, okay. So at that point, I knew that at some point there was a noise flash diversion device going to be needed, but I didn't know how I was going to deploy it or what Skirch's plan was for it. So the pouches for them are narrow, and sometimes will hang up when you try to pull them out fast because of the flap, because of the pin and the spoon on it. So with the anticipation of that happening, I opened the pouch, pulled it out, and then I have a dump pouch, and you'll see it in some of the still photos. It's a large pouch, and it's got a lot of shiny gold things on the side of it, which are breaching rounds. I opened that and put it into that big dump pouch. It's a pouch that's about 6-8 inches long with a wide opening. And there's no chances of anything that you put in there hanging up as you pull it out.
Okay. And was there any conversation about the taser shotgun?
The taser shotgun the conversation had already taken place where Weimerskirch had told Sergeant Ingram, or Acting Sergeant Ingram at that point, Sergeant Ingram now, to use the X-Rep first.
Okay. Did you say anything at that point about how to deploy the taser shotgun?
So I did, and I don't recall if it's after Mr. Boyd put the hoodie on or before, but I knew Mr. Boyd, and I'm guessing that it was before or after the hoodie was put on. In the announcements, we started talking about thickness of clothing on Mr. Boyd's upper body. I do know that the legs are a large muscle group in the body, and I know that when a taser shotgun is deployed, or a taser in itself and a probe strikes a leg, because of that large muscle group and what's referred to as the pelvic girdle, the muscle group in the pelvic area, it will disable an individual very effectively. So I told Rick with the thick clothing, he should focus on the legs, because you could tell he had thick clothing, layers of clothing on the top, but it didn't seem like he had a bunch of layers underneath the pants. But of course, they're very baggy.
Do you remember, can you describe what kind of pants he was wearing?
They were a BDU, a black BDU style, cargo style pant. They had big pockets in the front. The pockets, from what I recall, it had the pockets on the legs, the side pockets, the cargo pockets on the legs.
Okay. So Weimerskirch had asked you if you have a bang, you get your flashbang ready. There's discussion about Ingram. Weimerskirch instructs Officer Sergeant Ingram to use the X-Rep first.
Yes, ma'am.
And do you guys make any other movements at this point towards Mr. Boyd?
Not towards him, no.
Did you make any movements at all?
Yes. Initially, we moved to that rock so that Weimerskirch, if he had to, could deploy the dog from that rock.
Whose idea was it to move to that rock?
Weimerskirch's. As it began to continue to get dark, Mr. Boyd started moving bags around in his camp, and I wanted to see the bags. I wanted to know what was coming out of the bags. So Weimerskirch, we moved up in line. So when I say we moved, it wasn't much further than where I sit now to the edge of that wall in front of the jurors. It's 10 yards, if that. It was just a matter of moving out of that rock and moving parallel with his camp. so that with a wall, with that rock wall on the west side of his camp. Once we're in there, I could see all along the wall, of the rock wall, I could see bags, stack of clothing. I could see Mr. Boyd move around very clearly now. Still dealing with shadows and lighting problems, but I could see much better than I could at that rock.
Why were you concerned with what was in Mr. Boyd's bags?
I still didn't know what weapons Mr. Boyd had available to him.
So after you move up, did Boyd pull his knives out again?
Yes.
Tell me about the third time now that you saw him pull his knives out.
Again, he becomes agitated at our movement. He becomes agitated at the rifle, just agitated at the overall situation. And he, again, puts both hands in his pockets. At this point, I'm close enough now. I don't need my rifle scope. I can see with my naked eye what's going on, but I'm still calling it. Hands are in his pocket, hands are out, knives are in his hands. He points them chest level, and then at the end of his rant, flips them back in his hand, puts them back in his pocket.
Do you recall what his rant was? Were there any threats made?
I don't right now. He continually threatened us. We continually heard, we're going to kill you. I'm going to kill you. He made a threat when he saw Sergeant Ware at the bottom. Ware kind of exposed himself from behind the tree. At one point during the incident, he becomes irate with Sergeant Ware, seeing Sergeant Ware again, and he says, I'm going to come down there and kill you. I'm going to kill these guys, and I'm going to come down there and kill you, but I'm going to bring them back to life. I'm the angel of Jesus. I heard threats, a lot of threats from him.
Okay. Did you ever see Boyd retrieve any items from his belongings, other than his knives?
Excuse me?
Other than his knives or the cell phone or the sandwich?
I did. He began to, like I said, gather up bags, and he put on a gray hoodie with that red gap across the front. He stuck his hands in the pockets. And as he pulled his hands out, I could see as his hand broke the edge of the pocket, I could see that he had a dark colored object in his hand. As it came out, I could clear it as a mace container. So I told him, hands out, container of mace. He's got mace. And then he tells us, I've got mace. Dogs don't like that. He did, when the knives were out, he threatens the dog, he with the mace. He did threaten the dog. He said, I like dogs. I'll kill that dog. Don't send him. Then later on, he says with the mace, I got mace. I know dogs don't like that. But then in the same sentence, he says, I love animals.
So when Mr. Boyd, how close were you when Mr. Boyd put his hand in his sweater and pulled out this new weapon, mace?
We were pretty close to where the officer that I drew a circle with the crossfire, we were probably 30, 40 feet from Mr. Boyd.
Okay. And you didn't shoot Mr. Boyd at that point either?
No.
Did you ever hear, and I think you said this, did you ever hear Weimer-Skirch tell Boyd to put his knives down?
Yes, he told him numerous times. He would tell him, put your knives down, come down here and talk to us.
What was Boyd's response to that?
He had different responses. You don't tell me what to do. I'm not disarming myself. Followed up by threats. Each time was a very clear statement that he was not going to disarm himself.
Did you ever hear Officer Weimer-Skirch give Mr. Boyd any other directives besides to put the knives down?
So at one point, Mr. Boyd was, after him telling us, pulling out the knives and then the mace, he begins to gather bags. So he puts a ball cap on backwards, and then he tries to put on a small, it looked like a camera pouch over his head with his arm through it. But with the ball cap on, he couldn't get it on. So he takes the ball cap off, he sets it down, and he puts this camera bag with his left arm through it. Then he gets his backpack and a cup, like a Thirst Buster cup from Circle K, a styrofoam cup, and he begins to come to us. prior to this is, you could tell Mr. Boyd was going to make a decision that he was going to come down the mountain. He had made the decision that he was going to come down, but he'd also refused to disarm himself or follow any commands that we had given him as far as put your knives down. There was a command later on, put your hands on your head. But Mr. Boyd was going to come down the mountain. So you heard the exchange between Sergeant Fox, Weimer-Skirch, and later Sergeant Ingram, where they're asking for more bodies. They're asking for more less lethal tools. And Rick says, when Rick Ingram answers, he says, we need a beanbag and we need it quick. Because at this point, Mr. Boyd is no longer interested in staying in his camp. His interest is to come down the hill. We can't allow him to leave that point armed with knives. But he's making the decision. He's kind of pushing the issue. So he's gathered his bags. Weimer-Skirch tells him, put your knives down. And he says, I have the right to be armed. And then he says, okay, then put your hands on your head. And Mr. Boyd responds, I'm not putting my hands on my head. That's what people do when they're arrested, and you're not arresting me.
Okay. After that exchange, what did Mr. Boyd do next?
He set his stuff down, and he walked to the north, all the way. I can see him go all the way to the north of that rock formation now, and he yells over the edge. He's changing the agreement. You can't change the agreement. And then he begins to say, that's where he starts to talk about how there's no change in the agreement. He's going to walk off this mountain, and he's going to, but we changed the agreement by telling him to put his knives down or telling him to put his hands on his head. It was his understanding that was a change in the agreement. There was never an agreement.
So I was about to ask you, did you guys have an agreement with him?
No.
When you're trying to apprehend or take somebody into custody for felony charges, if they're armed with any kind of weapon, would you even let them walk down if it was in their pocket?
No. No.
Why not?
Mr. Boyd, with his threats, his aggressive behavior, his ability to arm himself with his weapon system and manipulate it as smoothly and fluidly as he did, that's dangerous, very dangerous.
Okay. So when were you instructed to deploy the flashbang?
So he had told Weimer-Skirch in that.
Who had told Weimer-Skirch?
I'm sorry. Mr. Boyd told Officer Weimer-Skirch during that exchange, you don't tell me what to do, I'm in charge. He began to gather his stuff again and said, now I'm coming down. And he said, I'm trusting you, but again, he wouldn't disarm himself. So
Mr. Boyd said, I'm trusting you?
Yes,
Okay.
Mr. Boyd said, I'm trusting you. So we knew, I felt it too, that he was going to walk down. He was going to walk off there, and he was going to hit the end of the rocks and start west. And he was armed with knives, and we would have to deploy less lethal to stop him. Because at that point, he bent down to pick up his bags. He picked up an extra bag this time, I recall. He picked up the backpack, the cup, and a blue bag that was full of something, a blue handbag. And as he was bent down, Weimer-Skirch said, bang him. So I reached in my pocket. I knew with him being bent over and being distracted by picking up his stuff, I was going to be able to move. And I could move quickly without him coming up, and I would be able to address the threat if it occurred because he was distracted. He bent down. I pulled the bang out of my pouch, and I turned, and I stepped behind Weimer-Skirch. So if he did look up at us, he didn't see anything different than, obviously he would see that I didn't have a rifle up at a raised low ready, because this is how I was holding it when while we were talking to him up there at that closer position. I was holding it here so I could look just above my optics. Obviously, he would see that, but he wouldn't see what I was doing. I put the bang in my right hand, I pulled the pin out, and as he stood up, I threw the bang, the flashbang. I threw in his direction. There was some concern. He was close enough that, and I knew I could throw that far. I didn't want to hit him with the bang. I wanted it to go in the area on that, in front of him or at his feet.
In front of him or at his feet, can you describe what the surface was there that you saw?
It was, so behind Mr. Boyd was a pretty level, flat surface. If I try to throw the bang beyond Mr. Boyd, I run the risk of an air detonation where it's in the air up near his head as it's going past him or even behind him in the air. And if it's an air burst, it's going to create some injury in his ears and things. So I don't want that. I want it in front of him, but the terrain in front of him is not level. So I throw it, and when I throw it, I'm thinking it's on track. It hits next to him at his feet and kind of bounces and then rolls out from in front of him into the rock crevice.
So where you threw it, it actually landed at his feet?
It was in the vicinity. It was pretty close to where I wanted it.
But then it rolled?
Yes.
Okay. What was Boyd's response to the flashbang?
He watched it come, it landed and rolled and detonated. And he had his cup in his hands, and I remember this very distinctly because I wanted to see those hands. When the flashbang went off, it detonated, I heard it, and then there was a moment where he stood still, and then he threw his stuff on the ground. And the way he threw it, again, me being that mental picture, it was like, so when you watch a hockey game and hockey players have their gloves on and they throw their gloves off before they fight, he threw it in that manner where he's just kind of snapping his hands down, throwing his things onto the ground.
Okay, at this point, had you heard any of the taser shotgun rounds?
Yes, the taser is beginning to fire now. I can hear the taser shotgun cycle. Because again, I have my mouse on, I can hear it cycle more than I can hear it fire.
Okay. So what was going through your mind at this point after you see Boyd throw his stuff down?
He's mad. He's super mad. And then the taser cycles, the taser shotgun cycled, and I anticipated to see a response from the taser impacts.
Did you see any response?
Excuse me?
Did you see any response from the taser?
No. I figured even with them striking his legs that you would see something. I didn't see anything.
So what was Officer Weimerskirch doing at this point?
He was standing to my right, and I couldn't see him. I could hear the taser shotgun, but I wasn't focused on the taser shotgun. I wasn't focused on Weimerskirch. My focus is Boyd. What is Mr. Boyd going to do? What is his reaction to now a flashbang being deployed and a taser shotgun being fired at him?
Okay. At what point did you actually see the dog?
So I can see the dog releases, and then Weimerskirch kind of comes up where I can see him in my peripheral, and then he moves to the east where I was telling you that game trail came further to us. He steps up on that game trail. So I see him moving, and I step to the east with him, kind of sidestepping, watching Mr. Boyd, and watching Weimerskirch out of my peripheral, because it's my assignment to provide cover for these two officers on the hill. So I'm moving to the east with Weimerskirch.
How fast was Weimerskirch moving?
At first, he wasn't moving very fast at all. He took a couple steps and then stepped out in front of me. It was concerning that he got out in front of me because he's in front of me. If he takes a step over, now if I have to deploy something, he's in front of my rifle. So I have to be cognizant. So I'm now watching Boyd and trying to watch Weimerskirch the best I can.
And at this point, could you see if Officer Weimerskirch had anything in his hands? Did he have a weapon?
No, I knew I knew that Weimerskirch didn't have a weapon in his hands. I've deployed with a canine with Officer Weimerskirch numerous times, and we've utilized canine's assistance in rope, and that's one thing is the canine handlers will never handle a gun and a dog at the same time, because the dogs, they get spinning, they get jerking on them, pulling. Sometimes they get excited, and it's not safe to have a firearm in your hand while you're trying to control one of those dogs. They're very strong.
What did the dog do?
The dog was released, and the dog made a line for Mr. Boyd along the game trail.
What did Mr. Boyd do when the dog was approaching him?
He saw the dog. He acknowledged the dog's approach, not verbally, but looking at it. And then as the dog began to leave, Officer Weimerskirch began to leave. And as Officer Weimerskirch began to move with his dog, he began to pick up speed and move away from me.
Were you expecting Officer Weimerskirch to move up?
No.
When he did move up, what did you do?
I tried to move behind Officer Weimerskirch in SWAT school, and I learned in 2005 to shoot on the move. It's while you're moving, you change your body position, put a bend in your knees, kind of lock your upper torso, and you walk differently. You're kind of a heel-toe walk, and your legs are kind of a shock absorber, so you can shoot accurately while you're moving. So at first, I'm trying to set my pace so I can be behind Weimerskirch, and then he's moving away from me. So I'm setting my pace to watch him, and I'm focused on Boyd.
Could you tell what Officer Weimerskirch was doing, or what was he focused on?
I couldn't. I didn't focus on Weimerskirch. Weimerskirch was moving towards Mr. Boyd, and he was at a quick pace, so my only focus was Mr. Boyd. My only focus was Mr. Boyd's hands.
And what did you see his hands do?
As we're approaching, I'm trying to, again, I picked up my pace. I'm moving at a pace faster than I know I can effectively shoot and move. But I know that I need to get closer to Weimerskirch. I also need to get to a point where Weimerskirch isn't in front of me. Weimerskirch gets closer, and I see Mr. Boyd's hands go into his pocket. And when he did that, I tried to come up, and I was trying to keep distance from Mr. Boyd. I slowed my pace, and I was trying to effectively just watch Mr. Boyd. And at one point when I came up with my rifle, as soon as I came up, there was still distance between myself and Weimerskirch. There was still distance between Mr. Boyd and Weimerskirch, but Mr. Boyd's hands were in his pockets, and they were coming out, and I could see the knives. I tried to step out as I brought my scope up, and I got a picture of Mr. Boyd. The right lower portion of my scope filled with green, which I know was Officer Weimerskirch. He stepped in front of my rifle, and he didn't completely step into my rifle, didn't fill my whole scope, while my bottom part was covered in green. I dropped my rifle just low enough to where I can see over top of it, and I can still see Boyd. And I'm trying to get around Weimerskirch, but he's moving a lot. He's down, he's up, he's moving around, and I can't get around him to try to protect Weimerskirch. During this time, I can't, because my rifle's here, so it's got a pistol grip on it. It's 4 inches here. It's here. The scope is, the top of the scope is about my nose, so I can't really see Mr. Boyd's legs, but I can see his upper body moving in an aggressive manner towards, I can see an aggressive movement towards Officer Weimerskirch.
At this point, did Boyd actually completely draw the knives out?
Yes, the knives were out. He had pulled them out, put them by his side, pulled them back up. So when I'm watching Mr. Boyd, though I can't see his legs, I watch his hands. So the top of my scope, I'm adjusting it to see hands. So his hands drop, my rifle will drop. Hands, hands. I'm just thinking to myself, hands, hands, hands.
And you said you saw a movement. Can you describe for the jury in detail what you recall the movement that you saw Mr. Boyd make?
The only thing I can describe is, like I said, I can't see his legs. I can't see his step. But what I can see is his chest is moving forward. He's made that first aggressive movement towards Officer Weimer-Scourge. It's at that point that I'm able to, there's a depression where I can step around Officer Weimer-Scourge, and he drops. Officer Weimer-Scourge drops down and grabs his dog. And when he drops down and grabs his dog, and he's down on his knees, probably on one knee if I recall correctly, and he pulls his dog in, and I step the best I can behind him and to the side of him, and I lean over top of him. And I'm leaning over top of him for two reasons. One, he's already been in my scope. He's already been in front of my rifle. If I lean over top of him, he's going to come up into my magazine and into my hand. Is it going to throw my shot off? Yes. But I'm not in jeopardy of shooting him in the back of the head or in the back. Also because we've trained like that in numerous times. I haven't trained specifically with Weimer-Scourge, but in SWAT training there is that where you get over top of someone and you can feel someone's presence. It's just like if you're in a line at the store or somewhere and someone comes up close to you and gets too close to you in the line, you can feel their presence. It gives you that uncomfortable feeling that somebody's there. So I step over top of him and lean over top of him so he can feel my presence, and he knows to stay down now.
How would you describe the posture James Boyd made when he pulled the knives out?
He was a defensive posture, is what I described it as.
What did you mean by that?
So in the academy in report writing, we were taught a defensive posture is how you describe someone's posture when they assume a fighting stance. It is an aggressive stance.
Did you ever see Mr. Boyd turn?
I did.
Can you describe what you saw to the jury?
So once there's a lot going on, I got to make sure Weimer-Scourge is still. I got to make sure he's set so that I'm not going to injure him. So as I come up and I bring my optics to my eye, as my scope is starting to break my eye, I'm not really got what was described as a flashlight picture. I'm transitioning to that point. As I'm obtaining a flashlight picture, I can see, as the scope is coming to my eye, I can see gap. I've determined that's going to be my point of aim, high center mass. And so as I'm beginning to get my flashlight picture, I see Mr. Boyd's, what I can see is, and describe as his upper body turning to the left. And it was about a quarter turn is what I observed when I was getting my flashlight picture. He's still armed with the knives. He's still standing in front of us.
What was going through your mind? What did you perceive that quarter turn to be in that moment?
He was going to try to flank us.
What do you mean by that?
So the layout was Mr. Boyd on an elevated position. Officer Weimer-Scourge is down on a knee holding his dog. I'm standing over top of him. Now, my foot's in a depression. I can only turn so far, and all along to the east of Officer Weimer-Scourge, there's yucca plants, cactuses, and rocks. So when I perceive a flank, I'm thinking he wants to move from where he's at, and the dog is in between Weimer-Scourge and us, to the east side along that cactus there. So if the dog is recent, the dog has to get through the rocks, through the cactus and through the yucca to get to him. I have to now turn to address that, and I would have to move, and Weimer-Scourge would have to stay down. but I would have to completely reposition myself behind Weimer Skirch in order to address anything to my right or to the east. So I perceived it as a flanking maneuver, that he was going to attack us from a different angle.
At what point did you pull the trigger? Did you make the decision to use deadly force?
As his body was moving that quarter turn to the left. It was during that time. And I fired my first round, and I remember my scope being full of gray, that fuzzy gray. I fired the first one, I fired the second one, I fired my 2 rounds quick, like I've been trained, like I've trained time and time again. I fired those 2, and I remember not taking, like you saw the picture of, Officer Perez's finger along the slide. I fired it, and so when you're trained to shoot a firearm, you're trained on what they call a trigger reset. So when you pull the trigger, it goes back, the rifle fires. In order for that trigger mechanism to reset, there's a stage in there. You can let it all the way out, but there's a little bit of slack until it catches the trigger reset. So you're trained to fire. When it hits the back, come forward and feel for that trigger reset. You'll feel a click in your finger. So I fired my first one, forward to trigger reset, fired my second one, and I put my finger forward, and my finger was off the trigger, but it wasn't out of the trigger guard. It was off, and I was watching, and I could still see gray in my scope, which tells me Mr. Boyd is still standing. He's still in front of me. I fired a 3rd round. When I fired the 3rd round, the gray fell out of my scope. I knew that Mr. Boyd had fallen out of my scope. I dropped my rifle to assess where he was, and he was laying on the ground in front of me.
Okay. I would like for you to demonstrate to the jury kind of what you just described.
Before the demonstration, let's just give the jury.
Okay.